everyone. Thank you so much for coming this evening. My name is Louisa McCall, and I'm the co-director of Artists in Context, which is a project out of Boston, but we have programs here in Providence, in Portland, Maine, and in Western Mass, the Pioneer Valley of Western Mass. The purpose of Artists in Context is to recognize the fact that artists are increasingly working beyond the studio and wanting to be sort of more embedded in the world, dealing with the critical issues of our time, issues of health, nature, justice, and other issues. And they work collaboratively with other kinds of creative thinkers, so they commingle different languages and different disciplines. And what we're finding is that they seek to create new platforms, new spaces, new representations that will help, all of us see the challenges in new and different ways. So tonight we're focused on research because having worked with a number of artists and presented a number of case studies of this type of hybrid integrative practice, we've come to realize that research and research skills are a really important part of the practice. So very generously, faculty from RISD have offered their expertise tonight to talk about different aspects of research for the artist. And I also want to thank Stephanie Fortunato from the Department of Art, Culture, and Tourism, who has co-sponsored the evening tonight, and of course the Providence Community Library, which has offered us this beautiful space. So Stephanie's going to say a few words, and then we'll get started.
Sorry. Nope, a tangle of words here. I just wanted to briefly welcome you. So we initially met Louisa during the cultural planning process, which I think some of you participated in 2008, 2009. And one of the goal areas that came out of the cultural planning process is providing support for individual artists and providing artists with resources such as workshops. So this is kind of a beautiful continuation of our relationship with Louisa and Artists in Context, and we're thrilled to be able to offer this kind of skills building workshop because we think it's really important for people to access these kinds of resources. And so I want to make one commercial for another event that we're doing while I have all of your attention really quickly. Resource for the whole community. On May 24th, we will be doing our annual Pell Lecture, and we'll be doing that at the Pell Chafee Center in the downtown. This year's theme is creative placemaking, which artists are certainly an intrinsic part of making our city a creative place, and so I think this will be an interesting topic. We'll be announcing the panel later this week or next week, so coming soon, but I want to save the date on your calendars now for May 24th for the Pell Lecture. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer Leese so we can get started with the workshop.
So thank you, Louisa, and thank you so much to Artists in Context and all of our co-sponsors for having us here, and thanks to all of you for coming. We're almost filling all the seats. That's great. As Louisa said, we're all from RISD, and this program actually originated as a presentation to graduate students at RISD who are working on their master's theses. And when Louisa came to us and said, what do you think about trying this out with a broader group of artists who are out practicing in the field, it was really interesting to us to think about how research might apply when you're out and practicing and outside of a sort of research-based institution. So it's been really interesting to us to think about it, and we'll be looking to hear from you after our presentations more about that. I'm Jennifer Leese. I'm the director of the Writing Center at RISD. And the co-presenters tonight are Ann West. She's a senior critic at RISD working in graduate studies. And Ellen Petrates, who's a librarian at the Fleet Library at RISD. And Ellen Driscoll, who some of you may know as an artist, and she's also a professor of sculpture at RISD. We're going to, each of us three, me and Anne and Ellen, the librarian, are going to present for about 15 or 20 minutes each on different aspects of research. And then Ellen Driscoll will present on her project, Distant Mirrors, which we see, for our purposes tonight anyway, as a sort of case study of intensive research practices in its many forms. Okay, so after that we'll have a little time hopefully for questions and your comments and thoughts. Okay, so let's see. It went away. There we go. There's our title tonight. So my job tonight is to sort of set out a context around artistic research and to think more about why research is even a topic tonight. Louisa sort of mapped that out a little bit, but how it's a topic in general for artists and how it's being talked about and thought about around the world at different institutions and in different people's practices. So I thought I'd start with these quotes from Pablo Picasso, why not? In 1923, he published a statement called Picasso Speaks in the Arts magazine. And it was long, it was maybe about a page long or so. But he kept coming back to this topic of research over and over again. And it wasn't exactly a warm embrace of research. He said, "I can hardly understand the importance given to the word research in connection with modern painting." And then he goes on for a while and he comes back to it. "Among the several sins that I've been accused of, none is more false than that I have, as the principal objective in my work, the spirit of research." And finally he says, "The idea of research has often made painting go astray and made the artist lose himself in mental lucubrations." How do we interpret this sort of demonizing, this defensive-ness around the idea of research? I actually need to do more research on it, but here's my hypothesis. That historically, if we look at this art historically, Picasso was past his Cubist phase. This is 1923, so he's no longer painting like that, the way we mostly think of him these days. But he was painting like that, in this sort of neoclassical, traditional, figurative way, which a lot of European artists were doing at the time. It's thought to be sort of a post-World War I return to tradition and things that we know and we can hold on to. So perhaps the fact that Cubism was often attached to discoveries in science, to research around optics, he was trying to sort of make a break from that period and contextualize his own work at this time in 1923. But I think that he gives us that's my immediate theory, my own. I think he's giving us a much clearer cue to what his resistance was about in that last quote. He says that research makes the artist lose himself in mental lucubrations, in sort of thinking for the sake of thinking, right? For obsessive sort of thinking versus art for art's sake. And this, I think, fits what a curator named Brian Wallace calls one of the most enduring and telling fantasies of modernist culture, which is the idea, this myth, that the artist is a sort of gifted or natural genius, that they're beyond the conventions of language or of intellect or of society. So if we fast forward now from 1923 and this rejection of research, here's today, most specifically in the last 10 years or so. This is a selection of books, there's probably about twice as many as I show here, of books on artistic research that have been published mostly in the last 2 to 3 years, in fact. And you can see from some of the titles, what is research, visualizing research, research in the arts, the artist as researcher, arts-based research, etc. That the it's also new, this field, this area of discourse, that the terminology hasn't even sort of fixed yet. So, by the way, these are in the RISD library, and Ellen, I don't know if you're going to show this, but has a sort of guide to texts on research in the arts that you can go to and see these titles if you're curious about them. I brought the one I thought was most applicable to practicing artists versus scholars or theoreticians, and I'll just pass it around in case anyone wants to take a look and think about looking at that more closely. Here are a couple of online journals on artistic research, in case you're interested in finding them there. This is Art and Research, which was started in England in 2006. And this is a newer journal for artistic research, started in Germany just last year. So as you can guess from this sort of tidal wave of publications, we've come a long way since the modernist dismissal of art making as an intellectual pursuit. In fact, we're at this sort of pivotal moment where research and its perception and its reception are radically present and also very controversial. So I'm going to sort of briefly outline the ways in which artistic research have been controversial by looking at some of the key issues at the heart of this research about research. The conversation around artistic research began with a confluence of two things happening in Europe at the same time over the past decade or so. First was an effort to build PhD programs in visual arts in higher education. So as you probably know, an MFA has typically been the terminal degree for artists, and in Europe there was this effort to make new PhD programs to make it a doctorate level pursuit. And alongside that, there was a European Union-wide effort to standardize educational benchmarks to make sure that everybody in Europe, all the countries, were getting on the same page about what constituted a PhD degree or a master's degree, etc. So this was happening at the same time, so a lot of conversation arose out of this and conferences and so on. That's why that first journal was, both of these online journals, in fact, are European, not American. But in the past few years, PhD programs in the visual arts have also been springing up here in the US, so the conversation has really crossed over to here as well. So as universities began to explore what it would mean to have a legitimate, so to speak, PhD, the first thing they did was they looked to PhD programs in the sciences. This is very established, very clear. We understand research-based institutional PhDs very clearly. It's often well-funded. There are refined methodologies, ways to measure empirical processes, and so on. In the arts, there weren't these sort of pre-existing, or at least they weren't formalized or made clear, these kinds of standards. So the trend looked a little bit like this. How can we make a crit look more like a lab? So in fact, the very first book on this subject that was published in 2004 called Visualizing Research brought this sort of quasi-scientific, very rigorous research-based system to studio practices. They advise how can you collect, evaluate, and present data in the way that a scientist would. How can you chart what you do? How can you measure it? And how can you make sure you present it? And this very scientific sort of mimicking, as you might expect, had a sort of backlash against it, right? Another book came out a couple of years later called Art Practice as Research. And as that title suggests, you can imagine the idea is that art making itself is research, that we don't need to adopt other models from the sciences or even the humanities. We just have to develop and acknowledge and formalize our own standards of what research could mean in the arts. So this debate and this kind of conventional wisdom that's pitted these two against one another kind of goes to a certain kind of assumption that I think a lot of us share about art being on one side and science being on another. One of the grad research workshop that we had at RISD, we came up with this list of binaries of ways we think about science and ways we think about art. So science is fact-based, art is about sensation, science is expert, art is practitioner, science is quantitative, art is qualitative, and so on. And the list actually went on, right? So we all agreed, wait a minute, art research isn't like science research at all because the two are so different. Here are a couple of quotes from two art historians on this subject where they're sort of validating that idea of artistic research. Sarat Maharaj says, the artistic research process comprises spasmodic interdisciplinary probes, haphazard cognitive investigations, dissipating interaction, and imaginary archiving. And Hank Slager, who did an exhibition on artistic research, says, artistic research can't be channeled through rigid academic scientific guidelines of generalization, repetition, and quantification. It requires full attention for the unique, the qualitative, the particular, and the local. So I'm very sympathetic to these arguments myself. I wouldn't want to see art sort of shoved into a scientific mold, right, and changed the sort of ineffable or unquantifiable aspects, the beautiful aspects, etc., all the things that we value in art. I just read a great quote actually by the curator Tom Eccles. He said that his role as a curator is to, quote, safeguard the irrational against the beast of rationality. And I support that. But a lot of the work that we do at RISD is about recognizing that art and artists can be and are sometimes just as linear and systematic and purposeful and rational as any scientist. And I think that these so-called scientific tendencies are actually just as worthy of safeguarding as those other more intuitive sort of acts. Here's a quote from Marcel Duchamp from 1957, an amazing talk that he gave, if you ever get a chance to see the transcript, called The Creative Act. He said, "To all appearances, the artist acts like a mediumistic being who, from the labyrinth beyond time and space, seeks his way out to a clearing." So that's the intuitive genius, right? And then he goes on and says, "But if we give the attributes of a medium to the artist, we must then deny him the state of consciousness on the aesthetic plane about what he is doing or why he is doing it. All of his decisions in the artistic execution of the work rest with pure intuition and cannot be translated into self-analysis, spoken or written, or even thought out." So I think his implication here is that artists can be analytical, can be articulate, they can be as concrete as the next guy, right? And that in suppressing that sort of left brain logical side, artists in fact compromise their own power, their own agency, their own ability to act in the world. So what's a possible alternative to this debate, this sort of black and white science art or rational and intuitive, these sort of dualities? I think it's to just acknowledge that all kinds of knowledge are valid. Ellen used a term when we had our talk of multimodal, right? Multimodal processes, to acknowledge that all of these kinds of practices are equally valid. To be flexible, to be interdisciplinary. And I think that this is the latest trend in research about artistic research. You know, I think when new things happen, we often go to one extreme and then the other and find the middle, and I have a sense that's where we're getting. In the foreword to a new anthology of writings about artistic research, the author, her name is Helga Novotny, includes a quote, and I'm going to read it aloud. It won't appear here, so just listen carefully. It's not her, she's quoting someone else. This person says, "Research is an endless process about which one can never say how it will develop. Unforeseeability is part of the essence of the venture. If one encounters something really new, then by definition, this is something that one could not have known in advance. It's impossible to say where a particular area of research will lead. One must also accept the unexpected and the disquieting." So do you think that's an artist or a scientist? Anyone? It's a scientist. And both. Very interesting. Good answer. It's a scientist, a biologist, talking about how, in fact, scientific research is not quite so linear and directed and end goal-oriented as we might think. This author, Novotny, goes on to say that all research, whether artistic or scientific, is driven by two things, imagination and curiosity. And she reminds us also that this shared drive to do research was not always so counterintuitive. In fact, it was not so separated until a couple of hundred years ago. We can think about Da Vinci as an example of someone who could think about research in both ways and always did. And she calls research, she sort of boils it down at its essence to what she calls the pursuit of new knowledge. So if we take away all those ideas about coming to some kind of proven truth and just look at research as the pursuit of new knowledge, could we ask, I wonder, is this research reading a secondary source in the library? Is this research studying from taxidermied models, in this case at the Nature Lab at RISD? And is even this research, is painting itself research? Is it finding new ways, new knowledge, new ways of seeing the world and conveying that to others and contributing to a sort of public sense of what that new knowledge is? So that's my presentation on where we are with research today. Maybe in the, more in an academic sense. and how this is being discussed in academia, but for some of the reasons that Louisa said, I think it really is becoming more of a universal concern, because art is happening so much more in public with collaborators. Economic imperatives are driving us to write grants that require research and a sort of research mind. You know, nights like this are happening. So it's a really exciting time to be thinking about this, because it's such a new topic. We don't exactly know what it is. I mean, I know at RISD we're talking about it all the time. It's all over the strategic plan, but when you sit down and say, what's research in the arts, it's really a wide open discussion, waiting to be defined or maybe even undefined from how we've always understood it. So with that, I will turn.
I've been kind of doing an analysis of myself as I've been listening to the other three speakers. And I've come up with the idea that I'm the assemblage, collage, sampler kind of a researcher. And that I prefer primary sources. And I've realized that my sources tend to fall into a couple of categories: text, poetic, and or political; images, poetic, and or political. So I think one thing that I feel about doing research is that I tend to get really, really overwhelmed. I mean, the thought of thousands of books or 1.5 billion articles, I can't get out of bed in the morning with that kind of overwhelmingness. So when I think about my own research tendencies, I think that I have a little bit more of a magpie attitude. I like a shiny ribbon over here and that photograph, and I tend to assemble it all, and then something starts to happen. So I think it's important to think about your own temperament and what kind of a person are you? Are you a magpie? Are you a more linear type? Do you like white lab coats as a special outfit? Who are you? And get to know yourself, and then it will all go a little bit more smoothly, I think. So I'm going to show very quickly, because I do want to leave time for questions, a multiplicity of sources that has informed a body of work, and especially a recent piece that was in the Providence River for 6 weeks last fall. The work started when I saw this photograph on the front page of the New York Times in December 2006, this body of work. This is a photograph of a rogue fire on the Nigerian pipeline that was created by something called bunkering, where people just poke holes into the pipeline and draw oil out of it as it goes through some very poor communities. And a fire occurred, and this photographer, whose name is Kintunde Akinle, took this photograph, which ended up on the front page of the New York Times. And I thought it was more incredible than a Hieronymus Bosch painting. And at the same time, a fellow artist had given me a challenge to make new work out of something that had to do with recycling or sustainability. So in that synaptic, nonlinear way in which artists think, I tried to connect this faraway event on the other side of the world with something that might be local in my own environment. And I started looking at the connections between oil, water, and bottled water, and plastic. And that led me to a visual research of oil structures in different parts of the world that have gone past their prime. So I learned about something called peak oil, which is when oil fields are all used up, but the architecture is still there. And that's something that I hadn't thought about before, that oil tips and then it's over. This is a photograph by Stanley Green from disused oil fields in Uzbekistan. And then just again in my sort of visual trip around the world, this was a photograph given to me by a great colleague. It's obviously someone with a bicycle and a whole bunch of styrofoam in China. And he gave it to me because I have a habit of collecting things. And he thought this was sort of my fellow traveler on the other side of the world, and he was not wrong about that. In my attempt to understand how I might be connected to that photograph in Nigeria I just showed you, I started collecting plastic bottles, in my neighborhood, and this is actually a clock. So that's 1 hour of collecting, and roughly I would get about 130 bottles in 4 blocks. And trust me, I don't make a public spectacle of myself when I collect out of people's recycling bags at 5:30 in the morning, because there's a sort of etiquette around that, and that wouldn't be cool. This was specifically a stage photograph to show how many you get in an hour. So in that sense, I was starting to do that sort of mapping that was being talked about earlier. I was counting, and this is my material research also, which Anne referred to. And this is what I would think of as the Ritz-Carlton of dumpsters. It's a lovely dumpster in upstate New York that had obviously no liability insurance restrictions. They just let me dive in and pick out my stuff. I wasn't able to count and map in that upstate New York location in the same way that I was in my daily collecting on the streets of Brooklyn. I did it in Cambridge. I tried to get my people here at the Monahasset Mill community to gather bottles for me, but they're so squeaky green that the count was very low and it wasn't very good yield over there. So in my research, I also was looking at sort of the structures of oil, and this was the very first piece I made called Phantom Limb, in which the host structure is based on North Sea oil rigs, and it plays host to a detention center, a McMansion, and then a colony of kind of shotgun houses that are pulled up by the dredging crane from down below. I had the chance to go to an oil refinery in Ireland as I was into like year 3 of this research. And when I got to this oil refinery, it was a ConocoPhillips facility, I had a weird thought. I was like, why did I have to go to Ireland to go to an oil refinery? And then I realized, oh, because they won't let an artist with a camera into an oil refinery in the United States. So, but I was given several hours, maybe 3 or 4 hours tour. I took hundreds of photographs, and I was able to make a series of large-scale drawings based on my unbelievably exciting and surreal time at this facility. Ireland is a country with 4 million people, and this is the only oil refinery in Ireland. So when I dialed it out to my own American landscape proportionally, again, I had those mapping kinds of thoughts. It was getting so big that I did get out of bed in the morning, but I almost couldn't because it seemed so big here by comparison. I made these tiny sort of disturbed collages out of my photographs, and then using a very old technique, and again, artists research things that other artists have done. This technique is sort of called grisaille, where you just paint in the gray tones. I made a series of large-scale drawings from my time at the oil refinery. So my research is open source in the sense that sometimes I go to places, or sometimes I'm just out on the street in my neighborhood, sort of trying to understand what the global warming apocalypse might feel like bottle by bottle. Sometimes it's book learning, sometimes it's the New York Times, and sometimes it's just by talking to people. This is part of this series of works called Fast Forward Fossil, and right there, part of my research involved the the Slater Mill in Pawtucket. So that sculpture that I just showed you had a section in it that was developed from this very early map of the Slater Mill. So that's an example of my interest, I guess, in primary sources. There's the Slater Mill under scaffolding in my sculpture. It looks like it's been caught sort of in a flood tide. And down below is a refugee camp surrounding a McMansion, an abandoned McMansion, I might say. There's the Slater Mill under scaffolding. This is the work of Ed Kashi, who was photographed in the Niger Delta, and I've been really, really influenced by a book of his work and essays by Michael Watts in a book called Black Gold. I think it was my contact with their work that really reinforced and created backfill for that original photograph that I saw in the New York Times. That's Ed Kashi's photograph of women cooking tapioca next to one of those bunkered fires on the pipeline. So they use it for cooking. And now we get to a local historic map of the 52 plots of land that Roger Williams gave out to the posse of people who followed him when he got kicked out of Massachusetts for his belief that church and state should remain separate. And he was given land in friendly arrangement with the Narragansetts at the time. I'm not sure that the Narragansetts had an idea about land ownership that was contiguous with what white people were thinking at the time. But Roger Williams was totally into fairness, so everybody had a slice of land. It was like slicing up a loaf of bread, and that meant nobody had better water access or a better view. And I became very, very interested in this map because it looked, as one of my students said, it looked kind of like a fish skeleton, and it is a map, and it also looks like the imprint of a kind of an oil tanker. So, and because I wanted to create a sort of an overlay, again, between our early history here and my fascination with our waste streams, my research into this involved just walking into the Rhode Island Resource Recovery Center and shaking the hand of Marcel Lucier and saying, please tell me about everything you do. I'm an artist and I want to learn more. And so I learned so much. This is one of 20 dump loads of just my kind of plastic a day that come in from buildings that are 3 families or less in the state of Rhode Island. So I was able to really get up close and personal with the intake, sorting, and selling and redistributing process at the Rhode Island Resource Recovery Center, and I can't recommend this experience enough. They're really, really into educating people. That's my assistant Diane, who's sort of showing the scale of the bales that they created this plastic. I want to also say that I did this work with a grant from the Rhode Island Foundation. So they made a custom bale for me of this filthy, crushed plastic. And then my 4 lovely assistants and I spent time cleaning all those bottles so that we could make a sculpture out of it. And just to have fun and so that we wouldn't get bored, we decided to start measuring how much water we used and how much time it took us to clean all this stuff so that we could make a sculpture. So in the early process of it, we started mapping our labor and our water use. That's making the lines of the map. That's Brook Street. We researched the early houses. Those are called the stone enders that the Roger Williams posse had, and we also had some Narragansett longhouses in there. And then there was also research into the 5 countries that source oil to the United States. So we made those oil fields. There's the map floating in the Providence River for the first 2 weeks in its sort of early stage with the stone enders and the longhouses on it. And nearby floated North America, surrounded by, in this case, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and I'm forgetting one of the oil fields there, but and then on the other side, well, that's the Tower of Babel under scaffolding. On the other side of the bridge was North America, surrounded by Canada and the Niger Delta. So the 5 top sourcing countries surrounded North America. And then in phase 2, we got out in our boats and we added an oil refinery to the big map. And we added what I call an economic seesaw with a great big house on one end and the kind of triple deckers of working class New England on the other end. And it floated in the river for 6 weeks, and after some weeks it looked like it had been chain smoking. But that's just river trash, although there were a lot of cigarette butts in there. So the sculpture acted actually like a filter. It was like a dragnet for all kinds of river trash and crazy stuff. So, and here's the last thing we did, which is the telescopic view of us in the studio, and then dialing out to how many of those bottles come into Rhode Island, how many dump trucks a day, and the size of the bale that we had. And then we dialed it out to the country of the, to the United States, and then to the developing world. And this was all based on text research that I had done. So it's a kind of a telescope, and it's actually not science. It's based on my own reading. So it's interpretive, it's got a loose structure, maybe it has the look of a lab coat, but it's really made by artists. So that's an example of an overlay of a magpie sensibility at work. Thank you.